And we are live.
All right, thanks, Usman. Welcome, everyone, to the Grafana Campfire, the Grafana community call. And today we are talking all about alerting. And we got really everyone from alerting. Well, I think alerting through the generations, more or less. Carl's here with me too, just like last time. But we also have Steve Simpson and Gilles, who are both working in the alerting team. And yeah, I think we're going to learn a bit about how alerting came into Grafana, how it sort of developed over the ages, and then what we're kind of working on now, right? I think that's what we have so far. So we also have Usman here representing the community team. And I would say let's go ahead. Maybe Carl, I don't know. Did you work on alerting first, or like who kind of brought it into Grafana?
I definitely worked on alerting first. Before we dig into that, Steve, maybe you want to introduce yourself a little bit more, what you're doing right now, and Gilles, maybe you also want to explain a little bit more than just work on alerting. Then I can get back to why this was introduced into Grafana.
Yeah, totally. So I started working on Grafana Alerting 2 years ago, and I spent the 2 years before that actually working on hosted Prometheus at Grafana Labs. So really deep into Mimir and metrics. But the last couple of years, been working on Grafana Alerting in cloud, keeping it running. Gilles.
Yeah, I can go next. So I've been working on alerting for the past more than 3 years now, I think. So came in right when we were sort of transitioning from what we now call legacy alerting to the new alerting system. And I've been working on the front end for that for over 3 years now. It's been exciting. I think we have a lot of interesting stuff in the pipeline for the future as well, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, I think I remember those days where because I used to run the alerting team as part of the data sources group. Yeah, and I think did I hire you, Jill? I think I might have.
You did, yeah. I think my first interview was with you. You were my first manager back then as well. It's like it's been so long ago.
It's been a long time, yeah. But then we split it out. Right, and now it's now you're also in a different department, which is an interesting kind of arrangement now, because alerting was always a big part of Grafana, but it's also become a very sort of interesting sort of intake to a whole other processes that we have now around IRM, and so kind of fits now to sort of with the future that we have. But yeah, start off in the Grafana department. That's pretty cool. Yeah, maybe back to you, Carl. And because you, I think, wrote the first parts, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So Grandpa Grafana. So 2016, one of the biggest feature requests for Grafana was alerting. Like they like dashboarding, they like visualization, but now they also wanted to alert on the same data. So we kind of had to figure out how to add that to Grafana. We started looking at different alternatives, and the things that at that state made Grafana different compared to Prometheus and other solutions were that first we were visualizations first, and we tried to cater for a lot of different use cases. And the second one was that we supported multiple data sources instead of just one. So Prometheus at that point was kind of new. They had a very interesting take on using labels for alert rules and alert rule evaluation, but we couldn't really rely on that because Grafana itself didn't have the concept of labels. And the biggest data source back then was Graphite, and Graphite didn't have labels. So we kind of had to constrain ourselves to a smaller feature set. And the way we attacked this was like, let's just figure out, like, deliver something very, very quickly. So we started by the screen, like looking at the visualization, the graph. What can we do from here? Can we add an alert from here? And from like the very basic usage, that's a great approach, and it got some initial adoption. And I think we got a few things right. So instead of going for some kind of check-based system, we went for a time series-based system where you perform a query and then you process that query and decided if the alert was supposed to be firing or not. But what we didn't get right was the labels or the dimensions. And this ended up in Grafana being a very one alert rule to one kind of server or pod or such scenario, because otherwise you will not get alert if server 2 breaks down when server 1 is already broken and so on. So the feature was really catered towards like small setups and not big observability use cases. We did explore getting like Prometheus into that mix, but it didn't feel natural. As the company grew and the project grew, eventually we had to do something about Prometheus because Prometheus was a bigger opportunity for us and a growing data source. So I think, I don't remember correctly, was it 18 or 19 when we added a plugin on our cloud environment for talking to a cloud alert manager or something like that? That's just details. But the next step here was definitely focus on Prometheus alert styles, alert rules. And our Prometheus team, they started building this alert capability in our cloud backends. So we started working on this, but we didn't kind of incorporate it into Grafana at that point. But the second version of alerting was primarily focused on Prometheus style alerting in Grafana. And that kind of left the first use case a little bit behind. You know, sometimes these things happen. You have something that focuses for one use case, you want to go in the other direction, and you kind of go too much in that direction. And I think eventually we had to mix these concepts, but that takes time because otherwise you're going to design endlessly. And I think that version 3 here is when I'm excited to have Steve and Gilles on this call to talk more about that. But honestly, like the first iteration was something I wrote in 2 months, and I'm very proud to have it being rewritten twice, because that means there's value in this feature, right? Like if you worked on something that's never been rewritten, it's probably not that popular, or it was perfectly designed. And yeah, maybe we should have perfectly designed it initially, but yeah, that's very hard.
I mean, Grafana wasn't very complex at that point either, right? So I feel like it definitely fit that model back then, and it was very visual, right? Like you had that threshold thing that you could drag up and down. So you had really this kind of like graph panel first alerting, which I think was really cool. And when we had the version 2 where we tried to optimize a bit for Prometheus as a sort of alert engine, I feel like we broke that connection, right? Like you no longer could just sort of drag something in the graph, but because you suddenly had more power with this label mechanism, but there was then like a clear disconnect. And I thought like that was a bit, that was annoying in the interface, and it was confusing to the users. And I remember like a great sort of time of pain where Gilles also joined.
We very deliberately in version 1 tried to make a simple solution. We did research Alert Manager, we did research Boson, I think was the name of another big alerting project, but it all felt too complicated. And also, like if you want to compete with something that already exists, it's going to be harder. So
but we also hired the Boson
we did eventually
at some point. Just not to work on alerting. Or I mean, somehow we did. He's done some work for backend support, right? But anyway, should we kind of move a bit forward in history, because now we're at this time now where version 2 is out, and it's a world of pain. The users had to select, essentially when they wanted to create an alert, they had to be aware if it's in a Prometheus style alert or a Grafana style alert. And I think that just this like one extra question just caused massive confusion. Do you remember those days, Gilles?
Oh, I certainly did. I think that was kind of the first question we asked users when they created a new alert rule, which is, do you want this to be a Grafana managed alert or a DataSource managed alert? Back then, we called them Prometheus or Mimir alerts, I think. And that, brought a lot of confusion from lots of different users, because back then I think we called it unified alerting, and then the first thing we do is we ask you to choose between two different types of alerts, right? So that was definitely, I think, a little bit confusing to the community. We're now in a much better place, I think, and even going forward, looking into the future, there's going to be a single type of alert that you create. But I think that kind of brings us to the first community question here. Usman, could you maybe bring that one up?
Yeah, definitely. This is something a lot of community users, especially on our community forum, ask in the very beginning of alerting, like, what is the basic difference between a Grafana alerting and a Prometheus alerting? Because both can deliver the alerts, but why would someone preferably go for the Grafana alerting? So maybe Gilles and Steve, you can answer it in a bit more detail.
Yeah, sure. I can take the first bit, and then maybe I'll hand it off to Steve for some of the more technical parts of that. So the first thing you should understand is the difference between the two is in how these alert rules are run and sort of like where they are being sent to. So with Grafana managed alerts, we really embrace this whole Big Tent philosophy that we have here at Grafana, where you can alert on any of your data sources, right? As opposed to a Prometheus or a DataSource Managed Alert where you need a Prometheus database or you need a Mimir database where your metrics live. We have a lot of customers that don't use any of those databases. We have lots of customers that use Graphite, which is still very popular, or InfluxDB or any of the other community supported databases, or like I think most of them are owned by us and we maintain them actually, so they're not community maintained. So we want to make sure that anyone who uses those databases gets to have alerting as well, right? So then you choose your Grafana managed alert. This Grafana managed alert is evaluated within the Grafana binary, at least as it stands, and I'll hand it off to Steve in a bit to talk about what that looks like in cloud. So those are evaluated by the Grafana binary. It actually queries your data source to grab all the data frames, runs those through what we call expressions, right? Because you're going from a set of data frames, you want to reduce that into a single number to then compare that to a threshold, for example. So as far as or as compared to the Prometheus alerts, those work very different. You just write a single PromQL expression where it just evaluates that every once in a while within the Prometheus or your Mimir database, and then hands that off to whatever alert manager that you have configured, right? For Grafana managed alerts, there's an internal alert manager that these alerts are being sent to. The contact points, or I think they're called receivers in Prometheus world, are somewhat different. We have a very large overlap in the types of contact points that we support, but I think the configurations are a little bit different between the two. So in the future, that will be one single system, hopefully, and that will be less confusion. And we wouldn't have to ask the user, like, do you want a Grafana managed one or a Prometheus or DataSource managed alert rule? Any questions about that? Because I also want to hand it off to Steve to talk about what we're doing with multi-tenant ruler and stuff.
No, just I mean, because this is all like a trip down memory lane. Is all coming back to me now. So this, so essentially, the Grafana alert is where Grafana just the binary sort of does it all, right? And with the Prometheus alerting, this was our attempt to have a bit of composability, right? Where we're essentially embraced all the various APIs that the Prometheus ecosystem also gave you, where you had the separation between this is where the alerts are defined, this is where they're evaluated, this is where the some rules have to be met, and then it fires. But then there's another sort of thing that looks at what's firing and only then does some deduping and then starts sending out the messages. So you really had this kind of alerting pipeline, this first really kind of composable sort of alerting stack. And for us, I think this was also the really useful to break out some of these things because we wanted to operate them more at scale.
Yep.
Whereas Grafana Alerts, yeah, it did all of these things in itself, right? But if you just put all this load on one binary, you hit some issues, right? Like, I don't know, maybe that's a good for sort of first setup for you, Steve. Like, what were we trying to do at scale here?
Yeah, totally. Just before we go on to that, I want to just add something to the Grafana versus kind of Prometheus sort of question, because I find this really interesting, and the way, because I've worked on both sides of this, and if you get, and what's fascinating is the idea of kind of simplicity is completely different depending on whether you talk to someone using Prometheus or using Grafana, and that was a big culture shock to me because obviously I'd been embedded in Mimir and Prometheus, so and they say about how you just create your files as YAML and it's really easy, it's lovely, it's simple. But then, of course, people using Grafana, they want to use the UI, and as you say, like they want the line on the graph to decide where their alert is, and they think that's simple. So, like unified alerting was really it was an interesting challenge, I guess, which I wasn't involved in a lot of it, but it was definitely a challenge of getting those two worlds to meet. So yeah, that's kind of my take on that. But yeah, so the scalability is kind of an interesting one because, as you say, unified alerting was a victim of its own success. So in Grafana Cloud, we saw huge uptake, I think, of Grafana alerting, much more than I think a lot of people expected. So obviously, Grafana Cloud has hosted Prometheus. It's big into that world, and we have a lot of users and customers that are deep into that world. But Grafana alerting really took off, and it's for a couple of reasons. Like some people, I think what really resonated people was the ability to have, as Gilles was saying, you can query your Prometheus data, but you can also query any other type of data. So people really liked having sort of one, one sort of way of doing that, one type of alert, to do that, even if they're using like disparate systems to actually store their data. So this growth caused us a lot of problems. So the first thing we really had to deal with is our database teams were coming to us and saying, Grafana alerting is destroying our databases. It's just causing us too much load. So we really had to kind of look in and dig deep as to what was going on. And we noticed a couple of interesting things. And I'll go over a couple of them just for the sort of interest's sake. One of the things that we noticed Grafana alerting was doing was, instead of, whereas a Prometheus alert, you would just query like the latest data point and compare that to some threshold. So you say, what's the latest usage of my disk, and say, is that greater than some threshold? Grafana alerting by default was actually looking back sort of like 10 minutes, 30 minutes. It was looking back over a range. And then quite often what was happening is it was just taking the last data point. So we had sort of unintentionally introduced this inefficiency that was actually causing us a lot of problems in the databases. So we introduced an optimization to pull those, essentially only query the data points we actually need. Another big win for us was, instead of having so you will quite often have your alerts firing or evaluating every 60 seconds. That's quite common. Especially in Prometheus alerts, like 60 seconds is quite a common interval for your alerts to evaluate at. And what Grafana alerting, unified alerting, did initially was it evaluated all of the alerts at like the 0th second of the minute. So you had these enormous spikes of load on querying like Mimir and Prometheus and Loki.
A bit like a cron job, or almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And there was actually, this is not only was it causing, because you get these huge spikes, you then get some of those queries fail because those systems have to, they don't have enough capacity to handle them all at, in the same second. So you get some queries failing, but what you also get is you have to provision those systems a lot bigger. So you have to provision them for that peak load at the start of every minute. So it becomes a lot more costly. So what we did is, this was inspired by how the Mimir and Loki alert systems actually work, is just to spread those, and I think Prometheus does this as well actually, is to spread those evaluations over the minute. So instead of getting the big spike at the start, you get it spread over the minute. So these were kind of all problems that we were sort of stumbling into, and we had to solve them really fast, because it kind of, as I say, it was like a surprise that so many of these rules were being used, and the problems kind of kept cropping up. It was definitely, a couple of years ago, it was definitely it was a busy time for us.
Yeah, definitely. I think from the community perspective, they love the alerting component of Grafana, and they raised some very good issues and even some good feature requests as well. And for those who does not currently not aware of our alerting community, so here's the link which you can also join. And myself and some other engineers are also active on the community, which can also answer such question or even help you if there's anything related to alerting. Yeah, back to you, Steve or David.
Maybe I can intercept something funny here, is the interval thing that you talked about, Steve. Like, we had so many customers and users also interval at 1 second. So we had to put like a mean interval configuration in our cloud environment. And people do set these kind of settings at very small numbers, or has this very weird requirements sometimes. And I think that is one of the hard things to deal with alerting as well, because it's easy to think that you need to run this query every second, but you might not. It's easy to think you might need to run it every minute, but maybe is also too frequently. It's very much depends on the use case. So for most observability use cases, 1 minute could almost be considered too regular, if you just scrape new metrics every minute, right?
Exactly. Yeah, as you say, we get that question quite a lot: is can I set the minimum? Can I evaluate my alerts every 10 seconds or 1 second? And my response to it is always, are you going to be able to respond in 10 seconds? Is that going to make your response time any faster? And it's probably not, because it's going to be a human looking at that alert, isn't it?
I think we had feature requests for only issuing alert queries like every hour, but exactly on the hour, which is also kind of a different clock compared to the clock we use in alerting currently, which is more like it doesn't really matter when it starts. It's somewhat around a minute evaluation. But if you want to evaluate it once every 12 hours, that's a very different feature. Then you kind of need some kind of ASIC transaction to make sure that happens, or some kind of locking at least.
Yeah, it's definitely important to know the use cases of what this kind of periodic, frequent querying is useful for. Because you say we have people coming to us asking, can I run this alert rule every Friday at 12 o'clock and send the result to a Slack channel? I was like, well, that's what you've described as a report. That's not really an alert, right? Are you thinking about this in the the right way?
I do wonder a bit, since we're talking about all these numbers and limits and capabilities, like in the sort of current implementation, like what is it designed to do? Like, what are good intervals, or what do you see people regularly do, or like what do you even do yourself, right, to kind of alert on your own systems?
It really comes down to how often your alert is only as good as how often you collect data from your system. So like a very common kind of scrape interval for Prometheus is people quite commonly use 15, 30 or 60 seconds. So having evaluating your alert rules every 60 seconds is it's usually more than enough, and that gives you a perfectly good response time if those alerts are going to humans. Like, there's no real need to go down to 15 seconds unless you have some sort of automated way of responding to those. And quite often you're using a different kind of system for that use case.
And have you figured out a bit of sort of the limits, or could we technically support every second evaluation, or yeah, what are the limits right now?
Once you get down to wanting kind of second or sub-second response time, then you really start getting into a different category of kind of solutions. You really need to start pushing your like this model of kind of like scraping and your metrics, collecting and storing, and then running queries on them. It starts to break down a little bit just due to inefficiencies. Like if you're scraping your metrics every 100 milliseconds, for think of an extreme example, and running your queries every 500 milliseconds, and that's actually going to be quite a expensive system to run. It's definitely doable, but there are more efficient solutions like to do that.
Yeah. Let's look a bit at the sort of overall architecture now, because obviously when you come from the community angle, you can still download a single binary. I'm guessing alerting still works as it used to do, or how does this all sort of fit together now with also the newer implementations that we run in cloud? Like, is there any sort of shared code, or is this all separate?
No, the same code that exists in open source today is the exact same code that we run in cloud for alerting. What we have had to do out of necessity in Grafana Cloud is build a system that's slightly more scalable than what you get from the single binary. But this is because we're really operating at a scale that no one else is. Like we run the Grafana for a huge number of people, and therefore we've had to come up with a system which can scale to cope with people configuring, any sort of shape of alerts that they can throw at us in really vast numbers. But that said, like that, the code that you run Grafana yourself, then it's all the same code, it's all the same features you're getting. It's just that we've had to build a system that can scale a little bit wider than you would need to if you were just running a single system yourself. And a lot of that work has been we've been inspired by our other systems, like our Loki and Mimir. They have alerting systems built into them, and we've been what's the phrase? Imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. It's pretty much taking the architecture right out of those and essentially wrapping Grafana in that, and that's how we're running alerting in cloud to really get to the scale that we need to be at.
Well, one of the limitations that Carl mentioned in the very early system was, I think you essentially had one alert per metric, roughly, right? Where you needed, for example, if you wanted to alert on, I don't know, like too much CPU for a certain node, like you needed to run the query exactly for that node, have the threshold defined for that node, and you only got the alert for that one, right? Now, I think our system now is much more capable, right? Where you can have these kind of summary metrics, and then if something in there goes above a threshold, or it might show you all these various parts that are passing it, right? Can you describe a bit that style of alerting?
Gilles, do you want to take that one?
I can take that one. So that was a good summary, David, of what multidimensional alerts are, right? So with legacy alerting, you would need to know sort of what your dimensions are upfront before you create your alert rules for it, right? So this worked great for those that have pet servers, not kettle, as we call it. So with multidimensional alerts, you can create one query that just looks at your disk usage of all of your nodes, for example. And what it does, it will create several alert instances, is what we call them, one for each of those metrics that is being returned, where there might be there's a label in there which denotes, for example, as a separate node, if you or a computer that you have, right? So one query, and you can get that discoverability sort of for free, right? So when nodes are being removed, they are removed from the dimensions. If you add a new node into your Kubernetes, for example, those automatically get added and picked up whenever the next evaluation of that alert rule happens, right? So it's a paradigm shift that is sort of in line with the move to cloud and sort of cloud native software. So yeah, in that sense, a great improvement, I think, over the old alerting system.
Yeah, something else to add to that buzzword bingo is that it also enables platform team thinking regarding alert rules. So in our case, internally, our platform team manages most of the Kubernetes alert rules. So whenever we create new software, deploy new software, we get a lot of alerting or standardized alerting out of the box. We don't have to manage that. We can, of course, add exceptions for our own namespaces if needed. But being able to write an alert rule once and say this applies to all my infrastructure is a very, very good way to enable the platform observability use case. And I think that's something we're seeing more and more and more, which is why the multidimensional alerting is so good.
Is this supported by other data sources now than Prometheus?
This is supported by all data sources. There's, I think, there's one difference which is, I think, important between the Grafana managed version of that and the DataSource managed version of it, in the sense that for your Grafana managed multidimensional alert rules, we actually track all of your dimensions. With Prometheus or with the DataSource managed version, we only track your dimensions once the threshold is exceeded. This is because of how Mimir works. It evaluates your PromQL expression and then only creates dimensions for metrics with labels where it exceeds the threshold. With Grafana managed alert rules, you get all of your dimensions, so you can see which ones are good, which ones are not good, and you get that full observability of all of your nodes or whatever it is that you're observing in that alert rule.
Okay, we also got one question, I think, on the similar topic. So it's asked by one of the user that we are all going back and forth with Grafana Managed Alert and DataSource Managed Alerting, and kind of stuck in between to manage the alert at the end. So, and mainly need to be synced by mixing the deployments. So, and there's the other part of it, which is also related to the CI/CD pipelines. So maybe any one of you can describe this in detail.
I can take a stab at it. Yeah. So if I understand the question, the decision between whether to use Grafana alerts or DataSource alerts, and stuck with DataSource alerts at the end because of mixins. So yeah, this is actually a really interesting topic, because at Grafana we're also in the exact same position. So we are heavily investing in Grafana alerting, making it better all the time. But we have a huge amount of our infrastructure is actually monitored with mixins and Prometheus alerts. So we also have this problem, and one of the pieces of work we're going to work on this year is to make it really easy to take those Prometheus alert definitions that may come from mixins or may come from else, and actually load them and run them as Grafana alerts. Because not only is there a big demand for this from outside Grafana, we desperately need this internally so we can start using the features we're developing when monitoring our own infrastructure. So I would say that watch out for that work coming. There's a community issue open, and we'll keep it updated with the progress. But I think that what that will mean is you can carry on using mixins, you can carry on using your Prometheus alert definitions, but then you can really take advantage of what you get from Grafana managed alerts as well.
Thanks.
All right. Yeah. So I think we talked a bit about on the past now and what the capabilities are right now. So yeah, maybe we talk a bit about the future, like what's currently coming up, sort of both in the way you think about the UX essentially of alerting, but also maybe what something in sort of the capabilities on the backend side. Who wants to go first?
Gilles, do you want to?
Yeah, I can take that one. So we have quite a lot of things in the pipeline. I kind of want to pause at some interesting features that we've already have available, mostly for Grafana managed rules. Things like I'm thinking alert state history, for example, right? So you can see sort of like you can look at your alert rule and you can see when it went from normal into pending mode, and then from pending into firing, and then from firing back into normal, for example. So you can like observe that state machine for all of your alert rules. I think that was a really interesting one. We've done a lot of work on role-based access control and such for like all of our enterprise customers, or those that want to sort of lock down who has access to which contact point or who has access to which alert rules by way of placing role-based access control on folders, for example. And as Steve mentioned, our as code story, there is one currently with Terraform, for example. You can do file provisioning with YAML files. But we're reworking that to also be able to ingest these Prometheus files. There's things like simplified routing. I kind of want to call that one out. We got a lot of feedback from the community that deciding or figuring out where alerts are being sent to was a little bit confusing, mostly because we've inherited the routing system from Prometheus, where it uses label matchers to decide how to traverse the tree to then finally end up at your receiver. So with simplified alerting, you just simply choose which contact point you want to send your alerts to for your alert rules. So that one was really exciting as well. Now, as we go into the future, we will be focusing more on Grafana managed alerts, right? There's various reasons why we do this. It allows us to develop features faster, right? So there's a lot more velocity behind that. And this is also kind of how we're going to be running things at scale in cloud. And we hear a lot of good feedback from our users that they prefer working with Grafana managed rules as far as the UI and the UX is concerned, because there are certain limitations that we inherit from the upstream projects such as Prometheus. So that's definitely a direction that we're going in, just to put more features into Grafana managed rules, right? Some of the in-progress work we have right now is we are taking another good look at sort of the scalability aspect of alerting, right? Maybe not exciting for a large number of OSS users, but for those that are working with, and I'm talking about like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of alert rules, right? Those kinds of users will be seeing a lot of improvements there. The UI sort of works right now, but it's very slow, it's very sluggish. But with the pagination work, that will all be very smooth sailing, hopefully.
That's interesting. That's one thing I think people overlook when we talk about scalability. Is it's all very well having scalable backend, but the front end and the backend need to really the front end and the backend need to be in harmony to really give a good user experience. And when you, as you say, as Carl said at the start, when you build a system fast, and you overlook some of these things, and it's natural that you have to come back and improve them later. So, when we start thinking about customers or users with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of alert rules, you've really got to start being smart about what you do on the front end and get it working nicely with the back end as well. So that's the UX team are putting a lot of work into that right now, aren't they, Gilles, I believe?
Yeah, we've already done a great bit of work there as well. I think we use things like web workers where we can to sort of offload the main thread so that the UI doesn't completely come to a halt whenever you work with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of rules that we have to go search through, for example. But yeah, we continue to invest in that area as well.
Nice. We got some more questions from the community. This one is definitely very interesting one from Tomek. The question is, as a platform team, we like to store alerts in a repository. Based on your experience, what is the best way to allow developers to add additional alerts as code? as a config file, either YAML or JSON, or maybe Terraform.
I can take that one. So with Grafana right now, you so the primary way of configuring Grafana, if you're not using file-based provisioning, is Terraform. Like that's what we suggest to all our customers, and that's really what's I would say the happy path to provisioning right now, Grafana, and that applies to alert rules too. We do get some concerns that writing that Terraform initially is hard, but there are features in Grafana to export. You can create something using the UI, export it, and they'll actually give you the Terraform, which you can then put into your pipeline and then start using that as a template to build more alerts. But there's definitely some changes coming, I think, in the wider Grafana ecosystem around as code this year. So that's something to watch out for, as we'll definitely be following what goes on there.
Yeah, I think for the near future, definitely Terraform is the way to go. And we're building out sort of a non-Terraform way also to manage those alert rules. But that's maybe for later in the year.
I think this is also a little bit organizational and depends on your philosophy, right? So, and most larger organization will kind of end up supporting both scenarios. So internally, we support both scenarios. We have some teams who are very, very, very opinionated about everything being as code first, dashboards, alert rules, everything. And while some teams are not as interested in doing as code, I personally think the as code is how you should manage alerts and dashboards for your critical monitoring needs. But the dashboard that you might not use for incident response doesn't really matter. So I think you need to think about it depending on like how will your organization be successful and how will they engage with the solution. If you try to enforce something they don't gonna like, then it's gonna be counterproductive.
Okay, we are getting questions quite a lot, which is good. We got one more. With alert rules and contact points, can you use file provisioning and UI to make adjustment? Is there a way to do the same thing with notification policies?
That's
Anyone?
a good question.
Steve, do you know?
Alert rules and contact points you can use file provisioning.
I'm not sure alerting support file provisioning, right? I think that's only DataSource's dashboards.
Yeah, I think so. That
I think it's been, if it did, it has been, I believe, deprecated. But I believe definitely through Terraform, you can manage notification policies through Terraform. You absolutely can do that. But yeah, perhaps not through file provisioning.
File provisioning is something we're going away from, even for data sources and dashboards. They're still supported, but we're gonna kind of move away from that concept. So for alerts, use Terraform, since that's much better and where the use case that we support.
I want to call out that there's also just the API that you can use, which is what Terraform uses, right? So if you have some bespoke tooling, go check out that API. We have that documented on the website.
cool. Thanks. We do have some questions. Actually, this one already came up before we started. So, and this is a good question. This is something a lot of community folks ask on the forum, like why there are alert folders and other groups the same as dashboard. So maybe Gilles or Steve, you want to take this one?
I can take this one. So I think firstly, I think there might be some confusion in the question, but I'll try and clarify this. In Prometheus world, you have namespaces, or in Mimir world, you have namespaces and you have groups. So a group is just a virtual concept, which where you place sort of the evaluation interval of all of the rules within that group. And the namespace really has no significant meaning. over in Grafana Managed Rules land, we replaced the concept of a namespace with a folder. There's still a concept of an evaluation group, which decides the evaluation interval of all of the rules, but we chose to use folders because of role-based access control. I think that's the short answer there. You already have the ability to place dashboards within a folder and then apply permissions to those folders and say, like, only this particular team has access to dashboards within that folder. And that was, so by using folders in Grafana Managed Rules, that was just kind of a natural extension of that existing RBAC model that our customers were already sort of familiar with.
Thanks, Gilles. Yeah, I think it's okay. Carl already answered one question directly in the chat, so thank you, Carl, for that. And should we go on questions? I mean, we still have around about 15 minutes, or we can go on some more topics which we want to discuss, especially around the future of alerting.
We could, it'd be quite interesting, actually, to follow on from what Gilles was saying about evaluation groups. This has been a kind of interesting topic with Grafana Managed Alerts, and leads on to the topic of recording rules. And this is a really significant feature that we added last year to Grafana Managed Alerts, and it's again inspired really heavily from Prometheus, to the point, we didn't even invent a new name for it. They're called recording rules because Prometheus calls them recording rules, right? So this concept, so the idea of evaluation groups has been in Grafana Managed Alerts because we've always wanted to support this concept of recording rules. And for those that aren't familiar with Prometheus, I can give a very, very quick background. A recording rule essentially lets you take like your metric data, and Prometheus lets you take some metric and then produce another metric, which is some function of your metric. So you could, for example, produce a sum of a number of series and just write that as a new metric to Prometheus. And this is a couple of really useful use cases. For one, it can be a really great performance optimization for like your dashboards and your alert rules. So if you have a dashboard that's showing like the sum of 10,000 servers memory over the course of, and you want to show it over the course of 6 months, that could be quite an expensive query to do. Whereas if you roll that data up with a recording rule, it's much faster can be much faster to visualize and create alerts on as well. The other interesting use of recording rules is just to transform data into something that's maybe a bit messy, into something that's a bit nicer to use, a bit nicer to explore. Internally, we do a lot of work with cost analysis. So we have lots of recording rules taking kind of raw data for like the usage and the amount of nodes we're spinning out, and putting that and transforming that essentially into dollar amounts, into we are spending this much on compute, for example. So recording rules, really useful, really powerful feature in Prometheus. So we brought those into Grafana, and what that gives you is not only does it give you those use cases you get from Prometheus, but the recording rules can work on any type of data. So Loki has this really cool feature where you can create recording rules in Loki and you can create metrics from log lines. So you can create a metric for number of times you have an error on some system, for example. So Grafana Managed Recording Rules can do that, but you can then extend that to any data source, right? Because it's just the it's the same Grafana alerting engine under the hood. It can query your SQL data, it can query trace data, it can query arbitrary JSON files you've uploaded somewhere, right? It's just a Grafana data source. So we think this is going to be really useful for our users, just to be able to, because some types of alerting really demand you use recording rules, either to transform the data in a particular way or to get the performance you need. So Yeah, this is one of those things where I don't think we actually understand all the use cases yet. It sort of opens the doors to so many kind of interesting things and interesting ways to transform data using Grafana. So that's really, really exciting.
I think what makes Grafana very unique in this position is the big tent, right? So pulling things from GitHub, DataSource, and turn that into metrics, or whatever big data solution you have, and turn that into metrics. So it's cheaper to query and issue queries all the time. I think that's very promising with recording rules. I'm very excited to see how we can use the big tent to create cheaper queries, or how to I think you get my point. Take the expensive queries, making cheaper by recording rules, and easy to track over time, because that's also one of the disadvantages of some of these BI solutions, is that if you want to track this over months and months and months, just having data as a metrics is going to be so much easier.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
We got an interesting one as well, a question, and I think this also relates somewhere between like what we can do with data sources and even with Loki, is to use Explore. So the question is around the Explore, that why isn't it possible to directly create an alert from the Explore dashboard and use it as a query? So probably the question is more related. What I understand is like use Explore to create an alert rule, or create an alert, and instead of like going into the alert rule inside the alert module.
I can take that one. It's a really interesting question with maybe a very boring answer, but I'll add a bit of context to it. There are various. So first of all, not all data sources are supported by alerting. The precondition for a data source to be supported by alerting is for a backend component to exist that knows how to query your database, right? So right off the bat, if you're in Explorer and you're using a data source that isn't compatible, we have to try and figure that out, like if we can do something with the data frames that it produces and whether it has a backend component, right? There's no technical blockers here that I'm aware of, so this is something we just haven't really looked into. This also goes for data sources that do have a backend component, like Loki, for example. So in Loki, you can create metric queries and log queries, but we only support the metric queries and not the log queries to alert on. Secondly, we also see that most folks create alert rules by virtue of integrations, right? The amount of users that go and manually create alert rules is quite small compared to the alert rules that are being created as part of an existing integration. Like maybe you've got your MySQL, you install a MySQL integration, it comes with some alert rules out of the box. So I think the boring answer there is I think we just haven't really prioritized it. I don't see any technical blockers for why it wouldn't be possible, though. So that's why I think it's an interesting question.
High up on my wish list would be like a UI that makes it easier to test these alert rules over time, and maybe to be able to go back to an incident and then tweak the query and see if it would have triggered during that time period or something like that. I know it's a quite challenging problem if you want to do this for real sense, like like the time range of the alert rule evaluation would have to move as well. But something that makes it easier might be good enough.
Right. So we did have at some point something called a backtesting API in the pipeline, which I think we either deprioritized, or I'm not sure what the status of that is, where you can indeed, just like you said, Carl, you go back to maybe a known incident and you run your alert rule against that and then see like, would this have caught what was going on, or maybe we need to tweak our pending period of this alert rule, or maybe the threshold isn't exactly what it needs to be, or maybe it's dynamic, right? So that's definitely something that I think we should invest more time in as well.
Boson had that feature, to be honest, like to give the project some credit for that.
Oh, sweet, nice.
Yeah, that sounds so useful. Just having a sort of like a little alert lab you can play around with.
A playground, alerting playground.
The other side of that's interesting as well. It's not only the like during this incident, why didn't this alert fire? But if you've ever been on call, the question you're often asking is, why did this alert fire? So dealing with flaky alerts is also a fantastic use of that feature. We should do that, Gilles. Let's do that.
It's a hackathon next week, isn't it?
Okay, cool. Thanks. We got another very interesting question. I think it's more about like from the receiver side for the receiver, like it's from Garo. It will be great to be able to preview the summary and title. We sometimes have to raise the alert to validate that the label, the variable label or values are correct.
Guys,
I
you're
think
muted.
I was thinking, actually, I wasn't really saying anything.
It's hard, right? Because any time you think about these previews, is you really need some data to inject into the preview. So I know for contact point testing, we actually have a feature where you can test the contact point and the template by injecting certain like label values into.
Yeah, I think.
So I guess it's sort of analogous to, sort of a parallel to that in a sense. Yeah, it's probably one of those things that I think I don't know if Gilles, you would disagree with this, is technically possible, but perhaps just not prioritized.
I don't see any technical blockers here either, honestly. I think it's just adding more input fields for, what does the summary look like under this condition, for example. And I think that comes back to sort of this playground that we talked about, where you maybe don't only want to look at some past data set, or maybe some data set that you pulled from somewhere else, but also look at other conditions, right? So like what if my alert rule contained these dimensions with these labels? Like what would that look like? Currently, the alert creation flow is very much sort of focused on sort of like what your system looks like right now. We don't have that, I guess, that playground aspect that that is being referred to in this question.
Yeah, thanks, Gilles. We have only like 3 minutes. Maybe we can just take one last question and can just wind up. I will take this one. We got one from the community. It's a very interesting one. Like it's also about like reducing the alerts or saving the cost. So it's from Gilles, if I maybe pronounce correctly, but the question is very interesting. So how would you analyze high noise alerts? You have example alert like CPU usage is high, and you have a couple of devices that produce noise, but you cannot really do anything about it. So you silence them. And there's a second part of it is that, but they still show up on the history tab. What you are interested is in noise from alerts that actually notify you. The on-call groups tell you what alerts send the most notification. So I think maybe not an expert on it, but depends on the interval we can reduce and set a timer, like this, how long should it be triggered an alert. That can somehow help here.
I think I understand. I think it took me a minute to grok the question, but I think I understand. So in our alert state history, what you see is when an alert reaches its threshold, it comes up as an entry then that alert has transitioned to firing, even though your notification policies or your silences may be set up such that you didn't actually page or send a notification to somebody. And so you can't use that data to analyze the number of notifications sent. So there isn't anything built in right now that I know of. Gilles, correct me if I'm wrong. In Grafana Cloud, we do expose, I think we expose some logging around this that you can use to analyze, but that's a cloud-specific feature. A common way to do this is to build. So some people have this requirement for auditing. They want to know like who has been paged and when, and it's a bit of a manual solution, but some people will build a webhook receiver that logs to wherever they need it to log to for auditing purposes. So you could build that, but it would be much nicer to have something like this built in. And it's something we have discussed, but again, it's just always down to priorities. So something we have discussed is a parallel to the alert state history, but for notifications. So you get a notification history, which will give you that detail that you actually want. That's definitely something that's been discussed, but again, you're just not prioritized.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think we are already almost about end of the time. Before we end, I just wanted to just shout out that for those who does not know about the Grafana Alerting community, we have a dedicated alerting community forum. So please join. It is a very good resource to ask for help, and maybe someone from us or even some Grafana champions can help you. And definitely for those who are new to Grafana and alerting, check out our docs. You can learn a lot about alerting. We have also some Killer Coda sandbox tutorial, which are also integrated in this documentation. So they can give you a very basic overview to more detail, like how you can create an alert and how to set up the rules and how to trigger it. So yeah. I think that's all for today, I say.
Yep, that sounds good. All right.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for today. See you some other time.
See you all next time.
Thanks.
Bye.
Have a good weekend.